The portraits lied beautifully. Under their layers of gold leaf and vermilion, beneath the lace ruffs and jewelled sleeves, an empire glowed with a light that seemed almost divine. Elizabeth Tudor. The Virgin Queen. Gloriana. The woman who had tamed an island and defied an empire stared from the canvas with alabaster skin, flame-red hair and a smile that promised eternal youth. She looked like the embodiment of perfection, a monarch touched not by age or flesh but by myth. Yet behind that immaculate mask was a body breaking apart. To understand Elizabeth, you must begin with contradiction. Her reign was a triumph of order built upon decay, a choreography of splendour concealing the slow collapse of her own flesh. The England she ruled was no different, magnificent in ceremony, fetid in smell, glittering at the surface while disease festered in its gutters. The Virgin Queen and her kingdom mirrored each other, perfectly radiant facades sustained by rot. Imagine the world she inherited. 1558. Plague lingering in the alleys. Cesspits overflowing beside palaces, rats thriving beneath pews where courtiers prayed for divine favour. The air of the London itself was thick with the fumes of tanneries and the sweet-sour reek of unwashed humanity. In such a place, cleanliness was not a virtue, it was a danger. Physicians warned that bathing could open the pores to miasmas, invisible poisons, thought to bring death. Water was the enemy. Perfume, not purity, was the mark of refinement. So Elizabeth learned early that appearance was survival. Every breath she took in public, every tilt of her head was theatre. Her tutors taught her rhetoric and politics. Life taught her illusion. When her half-sister Mary died, and she inherited a divided realm, she knew that the crown could only rest on a woman who seemed more than human, a woman untouchable by the common ailments of sex, age, or decay. Her body had to become the state's altar, but altars require sacrifice. To preserve the image of sacred virginity, she denied herself the ordinary privileges of being alive. She was forbidden to sweat, to age, to smell, to bleed in public memory. Every pore, every hair, every blemish became political terrain. A rash was not just a rash, it was a national crisis. A toothache might ignite rumours of witchcraft or divine punishment. For Elizabeth, the body was never private. It was a canvas upon which loyalty and fear were painted daily. Look closely at those portraits again, the pale powdered face, the jewelled eyes, the immaculate poise. What you're seeing is not beauty, it's armour. Venetian carouse, a toxic blend of white lead and vinegar, deformed her porcelain complexion. Mercury made her lips shine crimson. Perfumed gloves masked the odour of her decaying skin. Her elegance was an act of alchemy, transforming poison into power. But even poison has an expiration date. Behind closed doors, courtiers whispered of blackened teeth of wigs, concealing baldness of sores hidden beneath brocade. Yet to question the illusion was treason. Her beauty was not mere vanity, it was policy. It kept foreign suitors at bay, impressed ambassadors, and reminded subjects that the Queen's flesh was divine beyond corruption. The more her body failed her, the more she gilded it. The mask did not just hide disease, it became the kingdom's mythology. In the candlelit halls of Whitehall, light trembled on her face like reverence upon an icon. To servants and nobles alike she seemed ageless. Only those closest to her, the dressers who wiped her skin, the grooms who carried away her linens, knew the truth that England was never meant to see. And that truth was unbearable. She ruled in an age when death came dailies, when plague carts rolled through London's streets, when kings fell to fevers and queens to childbirth. To endure 45 years on the throne required more than cunning. It demanded control over perception itself, so Elizabeth made her decay invisible. The stench of the court was disguised by roses, the noise of gossip drowned by ceremony. The more her flesh rebelled, the more ritual she demanded, the bowing, the fanfares, the endless choreography of reverence. In the great balance between mortality and myth, she chose myth and paid in flesh. That is the paradox. We begin with a queen who built eternity out of poison and perfume, a nation that worshipped an illusion because it could not bear the truth. The story of Elizabeth I is not simply the tale of a ruler, but of a mask so powerful it devoured the woman who wore it. Beneath the gold and the glory was something human, something frightened, something rotting, and yet it was precisely that rot which sustained her legend. Because power, like perfume, is never pure, it is always distilled from something dying. In the next part, we will descend deeper into that paradox to the moment when the Queen's own body became a battlefield, and hygiene itself turned into a weapon of rule. Every kingdom has its altar, and in Tudor England that altar had a pulse. The body of the monarch was not merely flesh, it was the nation itself. To kneel before Elizabeth was to kneel before England. Her breath meant continuity, her heartbeat meant order, and when that heartbeat faltered, so did the illusion that the kingdom was eternal. This was not a metaphor. In the 16th century, the concept of the body politic governed both law and theology. A monarch possessed two bodies, one mortal, one mystical. The first bled as it decayed. The second was incorruptible, the vessel of sovereignty that could not die. Yet in Elizabeth's case, the distance between the two began to collapse. Her human body, frail and poisoned, was forced to carry the weight of the immortal one. Every gesture, every illness, every rumour about her skin or breath could destabilise the realm. The Virgin Queen's beauty was not just vanity, it was the skin of the state itself. Her public body was a map upon which England's hopes and fears were drawn. The firmness of her hand on a sceptre was proof that the country was safe. A trembling lip could be read as divine displeasure. In this world, to govern one's body was to govern the realm. Elizabeth understood this more clearly than any ruler before her. From the moment she stepped onto the throne at 25, she transformed herself into a living emblem, a kind of sacred theatre that replaced politics with performance. She was not merely Elizabeth Tudor, she was Gloriana, the incarnation of England's endurance. Her red hair was not just hair, but a banner of defiance against Spain. Her white face was not vanity, but a proclamation of purity, a sermon painted in lead and vinegar. The illusion worked, because the people needed it to. After decades of religious terror, Mary's burnings, Edward's fragile reforms, Henry's brutal schism, the English longed for a figure untainted by factional flesh. Elizabeth gave them what they craved, a body so controlled, so polished that it seemed to exist outside the corruption of ordinary life. But the cost of being divine was never being human again. Within her court the scrutiny was relentless. Every month pamphlets and portraits reaffirmed her holiness. Poets compared her to Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice returned to earth. Courtiers bowed so low they bruised their knees, not from love, but from fear of seeing what they should not see. For if the Queen's sanctity cracked, if her mortality were ever made visible, the spell would break, and with it, the fragile unity of a Protestant kingdom ringed by Catholic threats. Even her wardrobe was politics. The sumptuary laws dictated what colours and fabrics her subjects could wear, but Elizabeth broke every rule, cloaking herself in gold-threaded silks that announced, "I am exception made flesh." The pearls that framed her throat symbolised chastity, the diamonds in her crown eternal light. Yet each jewel pressed against skin that was slowly corroding. Ambassadors wrote home not of treaties but of her appearance. The Venetian envoy described her small stature, delicate hands, and gracious presence, while others hinted more cruelly at the stiffness of her gait and the heavy perfume that clung to her. To them, the Queen's body was a political dispatch, proof that England's divine experiment was still intact, or warning that it was beginning to fail. Behind this theatre of reverence was a deeper fear that womanhood itself was unstable, dangerous, too tied to blood and decay to sustain authority. Elizabeth's unmarried body stood as both miracle and threat, a woman who ruled as a man, yet whose every bodily function could be used to discredit her. If she appeared weak, it was the womb's disorder. If she refused marriage, it was vanity. If she aged, it was sin. She fought back the only way she could, by vanishing into symbol. She turned herself into the Virgin Queen, a creature neither wife nor mother, neither saint nor sinner beyond the reach of gossip or touch. But symbols do not bleed, they only crack. The more her body betrayed her with rashes, toothaches, fatigue, the more she demanded that her courtiers worship the illusion. She danced into her 40s and 50s long after her legs ached. She stood for hours in ceremonies, though she could scarcely breathe through the corsets that bound her failing spine. The court applauded, painted, and repeated the lie. The Queen was eternal, her flesh unchanging. Yet underneath she knew the truth. Every morning when the servants removed her nightclothes, she saw the marks of time and poison. She ordered them to look away, to act as if the blemishes were not there. Denial became ritual, and ritual in turn became faith. It is difficult to imagine now, in a world of photographs and mirrors, what it meant to live in an age where a ruler's body was a national secret. To glimpse the Queen unpainted was a privilege few dared endure. Her closest attendants signed oaths of quittance about her health, as if her decay were treason. For in a sense it was. To reveal her mortality was to remind England that its own glory might fade. The monarchy's survival depended on a kind of blindness, a collective agreement to believe the myth, even as it crumbled. Elizabeth had become both sovereign and hostage of her own image. Her flesh was not hers anymore. It belonged to England, and as her body began to fail, the question whispered in the corridors of power was no longer, can she rule, but can she remain beautiful enough to rule? In the next part, we'll peel back that gilded skin to the first secret her courtiers could never quite conceal, the Queen's obsession with sweetness, and how the substance that symbolised her wealth became the slow poison that began her ruin. Before the rot, there was sweetness. In the glittering banqueting halls of Elizabeth's England sugar was the new alchemy, the white dust of wealth, the taste of empire itself. To the common poor it was more precious than gold. To their queen it became both crown and curse. At her table, sweetness was spectacle. Courtiers watched as servants carried in entire landscapes carved from sugar fortresses, forests, beasts, ships, miniature worlds sculpted in white crystal. These subtleties, as they were called, were eaten not for hunger, but for glory. The queen presided over them like a goddess of plenty, her fingertips dusted with what the world believed was luxury. Yet each bite was laced with decay. In Tudor England, sugar came at an unimaginable cost. It arrived from distant plantations, first from Madeira, then from the Caribbean, through networks already beginning to smell of blood. Though the full brutality of colonial slavery had not yet reached its monstrous scale, the foundations were there: labour, exploited bodies, broken oceans crossed so that the tables of Europe could glitter with sweetness. Sugar was the taste of domination, and Elizabeth consumed it daily. The irony is breathtaking. The empire that would one day profit from human bondage was in her lifetime poisoning its queen through the very luxury that symbolised power. Every candied violet, every marzipan swan she bit into brought her closer to ruin. Her appetite was legendary. Chroniclers described banquets where the queen's dishes shimmered with syrup, her lips stained with rose-flavoured confections. She began her mornings with candied fruit and her evenings with desserts moulded from almond paste and sugar glass. In portraits, her pale hands rest on jewelled cups, but imagine the residue left behind, the stickiness of sweetness clinging to a monarch's skin. In a strange way, Elizabeth's sugar habit reflected her age's belief that control of the body meant control of the world. If she could consume the riches of her realm, literally ingest the product of global conquest, then she proved her sovereignty. The sweetness on her tongue was proof that England's reach extended beyond its shores, but sugar, as every physician of her day warned, corrupteth the teeth and the breath. No one dared remind the Queen. By the 1580s the damage was visible. Foreign ambassadors wrote home that her once beautiful teeth had blackened and fallen away. Her breath was so foul that courtiers reportedly stepped backward as she spoke. Her speech, once her most powerful weapon, became slurred and hesitant, the result of gaps where molars had rotted out. Still, the feast continued. Servants prepared sugar loaves the size of a child's head, brought from Antwerp and Lisbon, pounded into powder with wooden hammers, then refined into syrups. The royal apothecaries mixed them with herbs and spices to create what they called dentifrices, primitive toothpaste, which Elizabeth dutifully rubbed on her gums. The main ingredient, more sugar. It is hard to overstate the absurdity. The Queen of England, one of the most educated minds of her age, was destroying her mouth in the name of hygiene. She believed, as did many nobles, that the sweetness would scour away impurities. Instead, it accelerated infection. And yet, like all addictions, it was not only chemical but symbolic. Sweetness was joy, sweetness was control. In an age of constant threat, assassins, rebels, diseases, sugar offered a private empire that no enemy could storm. It melted on the tongue, predictable, comforting, obedient. Perhaps that is why she could not stop. Her courtiers, ever eager to imitate, followed her into decay. By the 1590s, blackened teeth became a mark of nobility. Women smeared soot on their gums to appear as though they too could afford such indulgence. The very sign of illness transformed into a fashion statement, a visual echo of loyalty. If Her Majesty's teeth are black, one noblewoman reportedly quipped, then so must ours be. It was not merely vanity, it was a performance of allegiance. To mirror the Queen's flaws was to partake in her divinity. The body politic decaying in unison made a perverse kind of sense. The irony runs deeper still. Sugar was fueling not only her physical ruin but her political triumph. The English merchants who financed voyages to the Caribbean and West Africa were laying the groundwork for the transatlantic trade. The profits from sugar and slaves would later build London's mansions and fund the same Royal Navy Elizabeth used to crush the Spanish Armada. While her empire expanded on the backs of others, her own body shrank under the weight of indulgence. She was becoming an emblem of the new age, a queen sustained and poisoned by global commerce. Sweetness and rot, twin pillars of power. Imagine her at supper in her later years. The room heavy with incense and torchlight, a table gleaming with sugared pears and sculpted marzipan castles. The courtiers laugh softly, their own teeth stained like coal. And at the head of the feast sits Elizabeth, elegant, regal, half deaf, half blind, her smile a ruin of black stumps ruling an empire with the same substance that is devouring her. Her mouth was the mirror of her monarchy, magnificent, diseased, unstoppable. The sweet poison had done more than rot her teeth. It had become a symbol of her reign, the price of power, the taste of wealth, the illusion of permanence. And when the sweetness finally soured, when every bite began to hurt, Elizabeth turned to a new kind of self-preservation denial. If sugar had corrupted her from within, perhaps purity could protect her from without, or so she thought. In the next part we'll step into the second horror, her war with water, and how the fear of bathing turned England's most glittering court into a kingdom of stench. There is a cruel poetry in how power decays. It begins quietly, a sweetness too long indulged, a small ache ignored, until one morning the queen who once dazzled her court with laughter can no longer bear to smile. By the late 1580s, Elizabeth's teeth were more than a health issue. They were a diplomatic concern. The French and Venetian ambassadors, those ever-watchful chroniclers of her court, noted that her speech had grown laboured. Her pronunciation blurred as if the words of empire had begun to crumble along with the teeth that formed them. One Venetian observer, Niccolo Malian, wrote home in uneasy admiration, "Her Majesty's spirit remains youthful, but her face, it shows the strain of many years, and sweet indulgence." In her private chambers, attendants whispered of sleepless nights filled with muffled groans. Sugar rot was agony. The gums swelled and bled, infections burrowed deep into the jaw. Physicians dared not extract royal teeth without command, and she rarely gave it. Each lost tooth was a small abdication, a confession that she was mortal after all. But vanity was stronger than pain. She insisted on audiences even when her mouth throbbed, determined to prove she could still charm an envoy or outwit a courtier. The result was excruciating. One observer reported that Her Majesty's words were uttered with a certain slowness, and those nearest to her were most afflicted by the odour of her breath. Imagine the scene, the Queen leaning forward, eyes blazing, voice trembling, as she delivered one of her famously sharp replies, and courtiers subtly recoiling, stepping back to escape the invisible cloud that followed each word. The stench of decay hung between diplomacy and obedience, a silent reminder that even His Majesty rots. Yet in a court ruled by illusion, to flinch was treason. They smiled instead. They smiled through nausea, through pity, through terror of being seen to notice. The rot spread outward, not as disease but as fashion. In an act that defies logic and yet defines human vanity, Elizabeth's courtiers began to imitate her corruption. The blackened smile became a symbol of nobility. Young ladies rubbed soot and charcoal on their gums to mimic the Queen's stained teeth. They darkened perfection into privilege, declaring through their artificial decay, "I too am of the court. I too can afford such ruin." One foreign visitor wrote almost in disbelief, "The English ladies show their teeth blackened, as if burnt, believing it an ornament of grace." It was perhaps the most macabre trend in Tudor history, beauty inverted elegance defined by disease. Behind these smiles lay something deeper, a psychological contagion. The court had long learned that to survive near Elizabeth one must reflect her mood, her gestures, even her flaws. When she laughed, they laughed louder. When she wept, they knelt in tears. And when her body began to fail, they copied its decay. It was devotion through imitation, a grotesque dance of loyalty where even illness became fashionable. It's easy to dismiss this as vanity, but beneath it ran fear. The Virgin Queen's image was sacred, and to appear too different, too healthy, was to risk drawing her envy. She had lived her whole life surrounded by rivals, beautiful women, young women, and punished those who threatened the mirror she needed to maintain. To resemble her was to survive her. In this way her court became a gallery of reflections, dozens of pale faces, powdered and perfumed lips painted crimson smiles dark as night. Under candlelight they glittered like a macabre parody of divinity angels with the teeth of corpses. There were whispers among ambassadors that the smell of the court itself had changed. Perfume and rot mingled in the air. The scent of sugar sweat and sickness clung to the hangings. Even the great banqueting halls filled with rosewater and sandalwood incense could not mask it. Diplomats returned to Europe bearing not just treaties but stories that England's queen, for all her power and poetry, was rotting alive behind her fan of pearls. But what those outsiders could not see was how deliberate the illusion had become. Elizabeth's decay was transformed into mystique. Her portraits still showed flawless teeth and ageless beauty painted from memory or imagination. No artist was allowed to capture her as she truly was, and so her living face, broken, black and human, became an unspoken secret guarded as fiercely as any military code. To the last she wielded her ruined smile as a weapon. When a bold courtier remarked that she had grown older, she fixed him with a grin that must have chilled his soul. "I thank you," she said, "for reminding me that time is my servant, not my master." The room laughed nervously, but in that moment her power was absolute, the kind born of terror and denial. In the mirror of history that grin endures not as beauty, but as revelation. For in those blackened teeth was the truth of monarchy itself, that power feeds on illusion until the illusion devours its host. And so the court smiled, with her each face a reflection of loyalty and rot. Together they formed a kingdom of beautiful decay, a realm where even corruption could be elegant so long as it bowed before the crown. In the next part we'll step from sweetness to water, or rather to the terror of it. Because for Elizabeth and her age, the act of bathing was not a sign of cleanliness but a flirtation with death. To the modern mind, filth is failure, but in the 16th century it was protection, for Elizabeth I and her world water did not cleanse it corrupted. The fear was not superstition, it was memory. England had been ravaged again and again by plague waves of black death that crept through alleys and across fields like invisible smoke. Physicians, unable to see the true cause, invented one that felt logical: miasma, bad air, foul vapours rising from swamps, sewers and unclean bodies. And what opened the body most dangerously to that poison water? Bathing, they warned, loosened the skin and opened the pores, making it easier for the sickness to slip in. Hot water especially was treacherous. It drew the humours to the surface, inviting death itself. Even the healthy were cautioned: wash too often, and you might wake the next morning fevered and coughing. For Elizabeth, whose body was the body of the state, risk was unthinkable. She could not afford a chill, much less a contagion. Her cleanliness became ritualized avoidance, a choreography of linens and perfumes that imitated bathing without ever touching water. Each morning began the same way. Servants approached the royal bedchamber at tableau dawn, moving as if entering a chapel. The queen's linen shift, the inner garment that clung to her skin through sleep, would be removed and replaced with a fresh one. The old shift, heavy with sweat oils and whatever dirt the day before had left, was believed to have drawn out impurities. The body was thought to purge itself into the fabric. By changing the linen, Elizabeth was in theory cleansing her body. It was a strange kind of logic cleanliness through absorption rather than removal. But within the alchemy of Tudor medicine it made perfect sense. The body was a furnace of humours. Imbalance led to sickness. Sweat and cloth were part of its natural maintenance system. Water, disruptive and foreign, threatened to unbalance the delicate harmony of inner and outer worlds. Elizabeth's attendants treated this daily ritual with the reverence of a surgical procedure. The mistress of the robes supervised. The laundry women stood several rooms away, forbidden from seeing the queen's nakedness. Servants washed the linens in rosewater or vinegar, believing the scent itself had purifying power. Every fabric touching the royal skin was counted, inspected, perfumed. No thread was ordinary. Even cleanliness was political theatre. When the queen did bathe, the act was more ceremony than hygiene. A wooden tub lined with cloth would be carried into her private chamber, an event requiring hours of preparation. Dozens of buckets of water were heated over fires, then poured carefully so the temperature would not shock her humours. The bath was scented with herbs, thyme, rosemary, chamomile, perhaps even a pinch of orris root for sweetness. And yet such rituals occurred only rarely, reserved for special occasions or bouts of illness, when her physicians insisted. The last recorded true bath of Elizabeth's reign is uncertain, and that uncertainty says everything. For months, sometimes years, she relied entirely on the illusion of cleanliness, new linens, rose water, and the constant fumigation of her surroundings. Her courtiers followed her example. The stench of sweat leather and perfume became the perfume of power. A nobleman who washed too often was suspect, perhaps effeminate, perhaps foreign, perhaps foolish. Only the poor, it was said, dared expose themselves to the chill of water. The higher one's rank, the more one's cleanliness was measured in fabric, not freshness. Elizabeth herself once joked, "I bathe once a month, whether I need it or not." Historians debate whether she truly said it, but the remark captures a truth deeper than accuracy. In a world haunted by invisible death, abstinence was safety. There was also something spiritual in her avoidance. The Queen saw her body as consecrated not to be profaned by base elements. To wash like a peasant, to immerse herself in plain water was almost sacrilegious. Purity was to be maintained through control, not surrender. Even her perfumed cloths, soaked in rosewater and dabbed along her arms and face, were applied not by her own hands but by servants kneeling at her side as though participating in a rite. Yet beneath the fragrance the truth festered. Her skin itched beneath the layers of unwashed powder. Fleas nested in the seams of her gowns. Sores and irritation spread where cloth rubbed constantly against unclean flesh. But the system protected her image. The Queen did not sweat. The Queen did not smell. The Queen was above the frailties of nature. Those closest to her learned to maintain the illusion. They burned juniper and lavender in her chambers. They changed the rushes on the floor and scattered petals to disguise the odour of bodies. They recorded everything. The frequency of linen changes the mixture of perfumes, because every detail of the Queen's routine was state business. The body of Elizabeth Tudor had become not only a symbol of the nation, but a bureaucracy unto itself. And perhaps in a dark way it worked. She outlived most of her enemies and every suitor. Her sister Mary, who favoured baths and simpler habits, died young. Her rival Mary Stuart lost her head. Elizabeth endured. To her subjects that endurance looked like divine favour. To us it looks like stubborn survival built on fear. In her world, water was not purity, it was mortality in liquid form. She would rather live in perfume and linen than risk the chill of cleansing. And so she did for decades, until the scent of roses could no longer mask the truth of rot beneath. In the next part we will descend deeper into the royal household itself, to the great houses, without plumbing to the waste that gathered beneath the silken gold, and to the invisible labourers who bore the stench of monarchy, so that England might call its Queen divine. Step inside a Tudor palace, and the first thing you notice is not the grandeur, it's the smell. It drifts beneath the perfume of roses and beeswax candles, beneath the incense and rushes strewn across the floors. It is the scent of wood smoke, sweat, vinegar, and the faint, ever-present reek of human waste. For all its gold and ceremony, the court of Elizabeth I was a world without plumbing, a stage of magnificence balanced on an undercurrent of filth. The royal residences, Whitehall, Hampton Court, Greenwich, Richmond, were architectural marvels for their time. They glowed with tapestries and glass music echoing through carved galleries. Yet behind every curtain was the labour of dozens of unseen hands battling nature's persistence. The Tudor palace was not a static monument, but a living organism, constantly breathing, rotting, and being repaired. To draw a royal bath, for instance, was a military operation. First came the fuel cords of oak and beech hauled into the courtyards, stoked by sweating men who fed the great copper cauldrons until the water boiled. Then came the buckets, dozens of them carried up narrow staircases by servants whose feet slipped on the wet stone steps. The water had to be poured one trembling load at a time into a wooden tub lined with linen. Every motion had to be silent, deferential. When the temperature was tested, a single mistake, too hot, too cold, could cost a servant their position. The bath itself, when finally ready, was brief and perfumed. The Queen's attendants would pour in rosewater vinegar and crushed herbs timed to sweeten lavender, to calm marjoram, to hide the smell of wood smoke. Steam thickened the air, fogging the gilded mirrors, mingling with the candlelight until the chamber looked like a vision painted in mist. But this luxury was fragile. The water cooled quickly, grew cloudy faster still. There was no drainage. The bathwater had to be scooped out by hand bucket after bucket and dumped into the courtyards or ditches beyond the palace walls. By dawn, the same courtyard might be hosting a royal procession, the ground beneath the horses still damp with the Queen's discarded bath. Every palace had its army of cleaners, though the word is misleading. They were laundresses, grooms, gong farmers, people whose names never entered the chronicles, but whose work made monarchy possible. They changed the straw rushes on the floors, though rarely enough. They scrubbed chamber pots. They burned herbs to disguise the odour of the cesspits beneath. Even the walls sweated. Lime plaster absorbed years of smoke and damp, until the air itself grew heavy. And through all this, the Queen's chambers remained the sacred core of the machine. Her private rooms shimmered with silk, yet beneath the embroidered cushions vermin nested. Rats ran along the rafters at night. The courtiers pretended not to hear them. Candles sputtered in the smoky air. The mingled scents of rose vinegar and mildew clung to every drape. It was not neglect, it was the limit of technology. The grandeur of the Tudor world was an illusion performed atop medieval infrastructure. There were no sewers, no pipes, no running water. Comfort was built on choreography, buckets raised and lowered, linens swapped, perfumes layered. Cleanliness was not a condition but a spectacle of effort, and yet that effort was part of the theatre of power. The very difficulty of maintaining royal comfort became proof of divinity. The Queen's body demanded work from dozens of attendants, each action rehearsed with ritual precision, lifting a sleeve, pouring a jug, folding a towel. The act of bathing, of dressing, of simply existing became a ceremony of hierarchy. Even the steam rising from her rare baths was political. It was the scent of control. Imagine the contrast outside the palace. Londoners trudged through mud, their homes darkened by smoke, their wells fouled by sewage. Inside, under the golden ceilings of Whitehall, Elizabeth sat surrounded by flickering light and the perfume of rosewater vinegar. Yet the same laws of decay applied. No matter how many tapestries muffled the walls, the stench of unwashed bodies and stagnant water remained. Ambassadors noted it politely in their dispatches. One French visitor described England's royal palaces as fine to the eye but grievous to the nose. Another, less diplomatic, wrote that the air of her chambers is heavy, being filled with fumes, and with the odour of many perfumes that cannot wholly disguise corruption. Still, for those who lived within it, this was normal, even beautiful. The haze of smoke and incense, the warmth of dozens of torches, the mingled smells of beeswax, roses, and humanity. It was the perfume of sovereignty. In the evenings, when Elizabeth entertained foreign dignitaries, the same hands that hauled her bathwater-set candles along the hallways, musicians tuned their viols and courtiers filed in their velvet garments, brushing against rush-strewn floors. The Queen entered radiant beneath the chandeliers, every jewel catching the light, her skin powdered into porcelain perfection. No one would dare imagine the machinery behind the illusion, the buckets cooling in the kitchens below, the servants wringing out soiled linens, the fumes rising from cesspits just beyond the walls. Such was the paradox of Tudor comfort grandeur, built upon labour perfume, upon rot. The palaces glittered not because they were clean, but because hundreds of invisible workers kept them just this side of collapse. And Elizabeth knew it. She had grown up in draughty castles and corridors, where cold crept through stone and death was never far from the door. Cleanliness, warmth, order, these were the privileges she had conquered through discipline and fear. In that sense, comfort itself became part of her performance, a declaration that she, unlike her chaotic father or doomed sister, could keep the chaos at bay. But chaos has a smell. It seeps through cracks and fabrics, through the pores of wooden skin. No empire, however perfumed, can hide it forever. In the next part we will step behind the powder and paint into the alchemy that kept her face white and her image divine. There, beneath the cosmetics of state, another poison waited the white lead of Venice, and the slow, silent death it promised. If power had a colour in Tudor England, it was white. Not the white of innocence, but the white of artifice, luminous, cold, almost divine. On Elizabeth's face, that whiteness became a nation's iconography. It was not skin, but symbol, and it came from a city far from London, Venice. From the 16th century onward, the most desired cosmetic in Europe was Venetian cerros, a smooth, pearly paste made by suspending lead shavings in vinegar, until they corroded into a milky poison. The residue, when ground and mixed with water or oil, created a foundation of unmatched brilliance. Venetian merchants who had perfected the art of distilling both beauty and death sold it across the continent in ornate jars labelled as the secret to eternal youth. The elite bought it eagerly, and Elizabeth most of all. She began using ceruse in her 20s, perhaps even before her accession. At first, it was just another luxury, a mark of refinement. Pale skin had long been the badge of nobility, proof that one's hands never laboured under the zin, but over time, as the years and responsibilities weighed on her, the paint became armour. Every new line of care, every mark of exhaustion was buried under the white veil. Its appeal was irresistible. A single layer could erase sleepless nights, fear, grief, age itself. The Queen's portraits glowed with it, her face an illuminated page against the darkness of her court. Yet the substance that created her radiance was quietly unmaking her. The chemistry of ceruse is cruel. Lead oxide, the core ingredient, is a neurotoxin. It seeps into the bloodstream, settles into the bones, and disrupts every signal the body sends. The symptoms are insidious: trembling hands, headaches, blackened gums, ulcers, hair loss, and eventually madness. In high doses it kills. In smaller ones like those Elizabeth used daily for decades, it corrodes, slowly eroding vitality while preserving the illusion of it. The lead did not stay on her skin, it entered her. The pores absorbed it each morning as the paste was spread across her face, neck and hands. The vinegar etched it deeper. Then when she slept, the residue flaked into her pillows only to be reapplied by dawn. It was a cycle of self-destruction disguised as care. Her physicians must have known something was wrong. Records from the 1580s describe her hands shaking during council sessions, her appetite faltering, her moods darkening. She suffered from migraines and insomnia. Courtiers remark that she could not rest, that she wandered her chambers late into the night, speaking to herself in half-whispered fragments. Some called it nerves, others divine inspiration. We might call it lead poisoning. But Elizabeth, ever the strategist, transformed even her frailty into theatre. When her hand trembled, she made it seem deliberate, a gesture of emphasis. When she lashed out in fury or fell into melancholy silence, courtiers read it as the burden of genius. No one dared name the truth. Her body had become too sacred for diagnosis. There were darker effects too, the rashes, the sores. Venetian ceras dries the skin until it cracks. Over time it eats through the very layers it was meant to perfect. When that happened, Elizabeth did not abandon it. She simply applied more, layer after layer, until her face was less flesh than mask. The cracks deepened, the paint thickened, and her image grew more spectral, more distant, more eternal, the Virgin Queen reborn as marble. Foreign visitors saw her and wrote in awe, but also unease. Her Majesty's visage shineth like alabaster, one Italian envoy reported, yet seemeth not of nature but of art. Others whispered that she no longer looked human at all, that she resembled one of the wax effigies paraded through Westminster Abbey at royal funerals. Still she could not stop. Without the paint, the illusion collapsed. Her skin beneath was mottled, scarred, inflamed. Every blemish carried meaning, weakness, mortality, imperfection, the three things a queen could never display. So she rose each morning and let her women apply the poison anew, her reflection gleaming like an icon in a shrine. The irony is devastating. In trying to make herself immortal, Elizabeth hastened her decay. The white face that promised eternity was killing her inch by inch. She was the embodiment of her nation, brilliant abroad, crumbling within. The very same empire that consumed the world's wealth was consuming its queen from the inside out. And yet there is something tragic and beautiful in her defiance. She knew the cost. She must have known. But to remove the paint was to admit that time had won. To keep applying it was to insist, however painfully, that she remained the unchanging sun around which England revolved. By the 1590s, her ladies whispered of the toll. They spoke of long hours before dawn when her face was washed and repainted in cement, the scent of vinegar thick in the air, candles flickering against the marble pallor of her skin. Beneath the perfume lay exhaustion, fear, and the faint metallic tang of death. Her body had become a laboratory for Empire's illusion beauty as control pain as statecraft. The white veil of Venice did not merely hide a woman's wrinkles, it concealed the truth that all power, no matter how divine, is mortal beneath the mask. In the next part, we will see what happens when that mask begins to crack, when the illusion she created turns against her, and the goddess of England becomes prisoner to the paint that made her eternal. By the final decade of Elizabeth's reign, the line between skin and paint had vanished. Her face was no longer flesh, but a surface, a national artifact maintained by ritual pigment and fear. What began as enhancement had become imprisonment. Each morning, as the attendants approached her dressing table, the transformation began anew. Vinegar's sting, the smell of lead paste, the soft scraping of brushes, as the mask of eternity was restored. It took hours. Layer upon layer, the Venetian ceruse was spread and polished, until her skin shone with a ghostly light. The hands that painted her face did so trembling for a slip was unforgivable. Beneath the powder were scars, blistered patches, open sores, the raw evidence of poison and time. Her ladies-in-waiting dabbed over them, gently whispering flattery to hide their pity. When they finished, Elizabeth would lift a hand mirror just long enough to inspect their work, not long enough to truly see. What she saw instead was what England demanded of her permanence. In portraits, that permanence was elevated to myth. Painters were forbidden by royal decree to show her age. The Mask of Youth, as it was later called, became the official template for every image of the Queen. No matter if she was 30 or 65, she appeared unchanged, smooth-faced, radiant, untouched by time or sin. Artists who dared stray from that model found their canvases seized and destroyed. In one surviving letter, an official of the Privy Council ordered all unseemly portraits of Her Majesty to be defaced. Another noted that such images do work her prejudice with the vulgar sort. It was not art, it was propaganda pigment as policy. Her face was the empire's flag and emblem to reassure subjects and terrify enemies. But the mask that protected her from the world also isolated her from it. Behind closed doors, she was haunted by the contradiction. Her courtiers saw the icon, she saw the cracks. The lid paste stiffened with every application forming fissures that could not be concealed. When she smiled, the paint split. When she frowned, it flaked. By the 1590s, she had begun to ban mirrors from her private chambers. Even the reflective surface of a polished goblet could bring tears. Imagine the silence of those rooms, candles guttering, attendants moving like ghosts, their faces pale with powder to mirror hers. The Queen seated to her vanity motionless as the paint dried into a crust around her eyes, the air thick with vinegar and rosewater. Somewhere beyond the chamber the world continued wars, voyages, births, deaths. But within these walls time had stopped. This was the price of myth. The artists for their part understood the stakes. They no longer painted a person but an ideal. When they depicted Elizabeth standing upon maps, her feet resting on continents, her gown embroidered with suns and moons, they were illustrating a fantasy, a monarch not born of woman but of destiny. Her pale face became a symbol of divine light, her body a constellation of the empire. The image of immortality hid the truth that the woman herself was fading. Yet paradoxically, the illusion worked. The more she concealed her decay, the more powerful her legend grew. Poets called her Astrea, the goddess returned. Courtiers compared her to Diana, eternally virginal. The white mask of lead and vinegar became the altarpiece of a political religion, one that worshipped image over reality. But even idols crack. The lead that smoothed her skin also made it brittle. When her attendants applied too much, the surface hardened like plaster. Any touch, a stray hairpin, a wipe of a cloth, could lift entire flakes of paint away, exposing the raw bleeding skin beneath. There were rumours that in her final years she had special silk veils made to wear indoors, filtering light out so that others could not see the damage. The facade demanded obedience from everyone who looked at her. Courtiers learned to bow deeper, to flatter harder, to pretend that the goddess still glowed. They addressed her as though her youth remained eternal, because acknowledging its absence was heresy. In their fear, they became actors, their lives revolving around a performance they could never leave. Elizabeth herself grew captive to the character she had created. To remove the paint would have been to erase Gloriana, the Virgin Queen England itself. She could not. The mask had ceased to be disguise. It had become identity. And beneath that identity, the woman dwindled. She grew restless, plagued by insomnia and suspicion. Her laughter, once famed for its sharp wit, turned brittle. Her meals went half-touched. Even music, which she once adored, fell silent in her chambers. Those who served her in those years said she seemed like a ghost haunting her own legend, translucent, watchful, aching for a peace that her own myth forbade. The irony of it all is almost unbearable. The face that conquered nations and inspired poets was not a face at all, but a fragile shell of powder, vinegar, and pain. It was beautiful, yes, but in the way a mask at a funeral is beautiful, perfect, still and lifeless. The Queen of Light had turned herself into stone. In the next part we will peer beyond the mask to the poisons that deepened her decline, to the red tint on her lips that shimmered with mercury, and to the madness of us that followed. For even as her skin turned to marble, the fire beneath it began to burn out of control. If the white mask gave her the face of a goddess, then the red upon her lips gave her the illusion of life. But this too was a lie written in poison. Elizabeth's crimson smile, that flash of warmth in a face otherwise carved from ivory, came not from roses or berries as romantic paintings suggest. It came from cinnabar, a compound mined from mercury sulfide, ground into fine powder and mixed with wax and oil to make vermilion paint. The pigment was prized across Renaissance Europe for its brilliance, its ability to glow under candlelight. Yet it carried a secret known even then it could kill. For centuries, alchemists had worshipped mercury as both miracle and curse. It was the element of transformation liquid metal that could mirror light and defy form. To many it bordered on the magical. Venetian and Spanish merchants sold it as the key to become eternal beauty. Physicians prescribed it to purge the body of corruption. But mercury never healed. It consumed. And so every morning the Queen's attendants traced her lips with death. They did it carefully, reverently, the way a priest might anoint a relic. A layer of red gloss over the cracked white ceruse, sealing the mask with fire. When she smiled, the colour gleamed against the pallor, warmth against cold life, against marble. but beneath that glow her veins absorb the poison drop by drop. Mercury attacks the nervous system. It makes the hands tremble, the voice quiver, the mind distort. It corrodes the gums, blackens the tongue, and eats away at memory and sleep. Modern historians have studied Elizabeth's final years and noted the signs: shaking hands, fits of temper, sudden tears, paranoia, insomnia. She could rage 1 hour and fall into desolate silence the next. Her courtiers called it her humours, but what they were witnessing was chemical unravelling, the slow, invisible madness of Mercury. Letters from foreign envoys captured this transformation with the detachment of those who watched from a safe distance. The Venetian ambassador Giovanni Scaramelli wrote of a majesty most changeable in her disposition, now gracious, now wrathful, now sunk in private thought. Another from France described her as a woman quick to laughter, and quicker still to anger, with eyes that flashed like steel and water in the same breath. They thought it temperament. They did not know her blood was heavy with metal. Elizabeth was not alone in her suffering. Across Europe, noble women shared her addiction to beauty's poisons. The Duchess of Ferrara, celebrated for her radiant complexion, died before 40, her skin ulcerated by carouse. Catherine de' Medici's courtiers painted their faces with mixtures of mercury and arsenic, their hair gleaming but their minds fading. Even Shakespeare's contemporaries knew the risk. "There's small choice in rotten apples," he wrote, perhaps with an eye toward a court where beauty had become a slow execution. But Elizabeth's tragedy was deeper. For her, cosmetics were not a luxury. They were necessity. In a court where a woman's authority was always conditional, appearance was survival. The world demanded that she be both ageless and infallible, a virgin and a monarch, a human and a myth. She could not show fatigue or grief or fear without inviting whispers that the Virgin Queen had lost God's favour. And so she painted. Every stroke of mercury and lead was an act of defiance, a declaration that she would not yield to time or men. Yet the irony was merciless. The more she fought decay, the more it consumed her. The chemicals corroded not only her skin, but her sense of self. Her mind, once famed for precision and wit, began to fray. She forgot names, she repeated commands. In her final years, she would pace her chambers long into the night, muttering prayers, refusing to sit or sleep as though rest itself might summon death. The courtiers who remembered her in youth, fierce, articulate, brilliant, now found her volatile and withdrawn. Some blamed loneliness, others whispered of guilt. Few dared suspect that her slow unmaking was physical, that her body had become an experiment in the toxic science of beauty. There was something cruelly symbolic about it. The empire she ruled drew its wealth from extraction metals torn from mountains, labour, torn from bodies. And now the queen herself was being mined from within her vitality, leached by the same alchemical hunger that fueled her age. The poison on her lips was not just personal, it was political, the cost of power rendered in flesh. Yet even at her worst, she understood the performance she was trapped inside. "We princes," she once said, "are set on stages in the sight and view of all the world." She could not step down. The mask, though it burned her skin and blurred her mind, was her crown. When she appeared before her, people trembling but smiling that painted smile, they cheered. They saw not sickness but splendour, not madness but majesty, and that perhaps was the most tragic success of all. For every woman in that era, queen or commoner, beauty was both weapon and wound. It offered visibility in a world built to erase them, yet punished them for wielding it. Elizabeth's face became the mirror of their dilemma to be seen. She had to disappear behind the paint, the white of Venice, the red of Mercury. Together they created an image history would call glorious. But beneath it was a human being unravelling in private, her genius dimmed by the very substances that made her legend shine. In the next part we'll watch that legend retreat further, as Elizabeth, terrified of her own reflection, banishes mirrors and lives surrounded only by painted memories of a youth that never truly existed. There comes a moment in every life when the face in the mirror becomes a stranger. For Elizabeth Tudor, that moment arrived quietly, not with a scream, but with silence. One by one, the mirrors vanished from her chambers. At first, it was said to be superstition. Courtiers whispered that the queen nearing 70 had grown vain. Others said she feared omens, that a mirror reflected not one's beauty, but one's soul, and hers had become burdened by sin, by poison, by time. But the truth was simpler and sadder. She could no longer bear to look at herself. The image that stared back was not the radiant Gloriana of her portraits. The skin beneath the powder was ravaged. the hair thinned to pale wisps, the lips drawn tight from the tremors of Mercury and age. Her own reflection had become treason, a reminder that the goddess England worshipped was after all only human, and so she exiled the glass. Mirrors were removed from her apartments, covered or sent away to storerooms. The gilt frames that once reflected her courtly dances now held empty velvet panels. The only reflections allowed were painted ones, her own youthful likenesses hung on every wall like relics of a vanished faith. She relied on memory instead, on the version of herself that lived in the minds of her subjects, the image she had crafted so carefully over decades. Her attendants helped her dress and paint each morning in near darkness, guided by a ritual more than just sudden sight. The process was devotional. The linen laid out, the brushes arranged in order, the mixture of lead and vinegar stirred until it gleamed like pearl. She would sit motionless as they worked, eyes closed, mouthing the Latin prayers of her childhood. This was not vanity anymore. It was survival. For Elizabeth, the mask had become the last barrier between her and mortality. Every crack in the paint was a crack in the kingdom. Every tremor of her hand, every faltering step felt like the empire itself beginning to crumble. England's golden age had been built on her endurance, her face printed on coins, her name sung in churches, her image burned into the minds of millions. What would happen when that image failed? In those final years, the Queen's solitude deepened. Her closest friends were gone. Leicester dead, Walsingham gone, Essex executed. The generation that had once worshipped her as the Virgin of Power was replaced by younger courtiers who whispered about her trembling voice and haunted eyes. She grew paranoid, convinced that plots moved in every shadow. Her food was tasted twice, her letters sealed with her own trembling hands. Without mirrors, she became dependent on others to tell her who she was. "How do I look?" she would ask softly. And they always answered the same way, as radiant as ever. "Your Majesty." The lie became a kind of mercy, a shared illusion that preserved them all. But no one can live indefinitely inside a myth. The boundaries between memory and flesh began to dissolve. At night, she walked her chambers in silence, touching the frames of her old portraits as though to reassure herself that they still existed, that she still existed. The faces in the paintings smiled back with their frozen youth, while her own body sagged beneath layers of stiff brocade. She was living among ghosts of herself. There is one story, perhaps legend, perhaps truth, that in her last winter she ordered a mirror uncovered by mistake. It had been left behind by a careless servant. For a moment she saw herself as she was, the cracked mask, the hollow eyes, the tremor that would not still. Witnesses said she stared in silence, then turned away whispering, "Time hath overcome me." The mirror was removed and she never asked for another. Her fear was not just of age, but of what it meant. The empire she had built, the voyages, the wars, the poetry, the glory, was bound to her body. If she fell, it would too. In her reflection, she saw not only her own mortality, but the end of her age. The sun of England dimming. In those final months, she began to speak more often of the dead. She would recall her father's fury, her mother's execution, her lost suitors. "I am a tree that hath long stood," she told a courtier, "and winds begin to shake my leaves." She wept easily, then the tears carving faint lines through the white lead on her cheeks. Sometimes she refused to sit, even through exhaustion, as if afraid that to rest was to surrender. She would stand through hours of council meetings pale as marble, her once commanding voice reduced to a thin thread of sound. Sleep eluded her. Her ladies reported that she passed her nights pacing, murmuring half-formed prayers and fragments of old speeches. It was as though she feared that if she closed her eyes the mask might fall away and the kingdom forget her by dawn. And yet despite the frailty she retained, flashes of the old brilliance, a wit that cut like glass, a presence that could silence a hall. There were moments when the mask did not matter, when the woman beneath re-emerged proud and lonely and incandescent. "You may well have many princes," she once told her council, "but never such another queen." The tragedy of Elizabeth's last years was not her decay, but her awareness of it. She had built her entire existence upon an image that could not age, and now she lived in its shadow. Without mirrors, without rest, she lingered in a twilight between memory and death, too human to be eternal, too eternal to be human again. When she finally died in March 1603, the mask still held. She refused the bed, dying upright, fully dressed, her face painted to the last. The courtiers who entered afterward said she looked serene, untouched, as if even death had agreed to maintain the illusion. In the stillness of that final room, surrounded by portraits of the woman she had once been, the legend, and the flesh finally parted ways. The empire would go on without her, but the face of England, her face, would never look the same again. In the next part, we will follow the fading of that face beyond her death, how her portraits became relics, how her image was reshaped by generations that needed their queen to remain eternal, and how myth devoured the woman it once served. Before the eye ever met her, the nose did. Elizabeth's presence was heralded by scent and invisible crown of roses, spices and musk that drifted ahead of her like a divine aura. It was said that one could tell the queen was coming long before she entered the room. To breathe the air she left behind was to inhale the perfume of majesty itself. Fragrance for Elizabeth was not pleasure. It was survival. The Tudor world stank. The Thames reeked of waste, the streets of sweat and dung and smoke. Within the palaces, chamber pots overflowed, rushes on the floors rotted, and disease clung to the very walls. But to the Elizabethan mind, odour was more than nuisance. It was moral language. Sweetness signified virtue. Foulness, sin. To smell clean was to be pure, blessed, divinely favoured, and no one could afford impurity less than the Virgin Queen. So she built a fortress of fragrance, pomanders, small ornate spheres of gold or silver, pierced with filigree hung from her waist or nestled in her gloved hands. Inside were packed layers of dried herbs, ambergris, cloves, orris root and resin. When she moved, they released a slow exhale of sweetness, masking whatever lingered beneath her painted skin. Courtiers said she would raise one to her nose in conversation as if pondering a thought, though. In truth, she was simply shielding herself from the human stench of proximity. Her gloves, too, were soaked in perfume, the most exquisite leather imported from Spain, tanned with civet, myrtle and rosewater. She wore them constantly, removing them only during ceremonial blessings or when writing with her favoured quills. In her portraits, the gloved hand became signature, not a gesture of warmth but of distance. The scent was her armour. Even her handkerchiefs were weapons of odour. They were drenched in distilled rosewater pressed with orange blossom, folded into delicate triangles and embroidered with gold thread. When she dabbed her lips or offered one to a suitor, the gesture carried more than courtly grace, it carried the assertion of superiority. To smell sweet in a fetid age was to declare oneself touched by heaven. Every movement, every breath she took reinforced the illusion. The queen did not smell like other mortals. She was the still point of cleanliness in a rotting world. But the deeper truth was more tragic. She was not masking the filth of others, she was masking her own. Years of unwashed skin of lead and mercury poisoning had left her body betraying itself. The scent that wafted from beneath the silks and powder was not entirely floral. Her attendants reported the necessity of constant fumigation, burning juniper in her chambers, scattering petals and sweet herbs underfoot, perfuming her gowns with musk to drown the odour of decay. The queen who embodied purity was decaying from within, and only perfume stood between her and revelation. Odour in that world was revelation itself. To smell bad was to invite judgment, physical and moral. Physicians warned that foul smells caused illness. Theologians warned that they revealed corruption of the soul. Elizabeth understood both. If her scent faltered, so did her sanctity, and so she ruled through fragrance. When she received ambassadors, her rooms were thick with the perfume of roses and amber. The air itself was a statement. This was not the stinking Europe of plague and mud, but the perfumed realm of Gloriana. Scent became propaganda, a declaration of divine order. Her presence was theatrical purity, a sensory miracle designed to overwhelm reason. The courtiers followed her example with desperate devotion. They wore pomanders like medals, soaked their cuffs in lavender oil, and competed to invent new fragrances for favour. A perfumed glove from the queen could raise a man's fortune overnight. To receive one was to be literally blessed by her scent, a whiff of heaven, carried on leather. But there was irony in this olfactory empire. The more she tried to erase the smell of mortality, the more it consumed her. The perfumes grew heavier, muskier, cloying. Visitors sometimes complained that the queen's chambers were asphyxiating with sweetness, the air thick enough to taste. It was as if she had turned her private apartments into a gilded cage of roses, a cage she could never leave. And in that scented confinement she found a strange kind of control. Fragrance was the only sense she could still command absolutely. Her body trembled, her sight dimmed, her hearing dulled, but her nose remained keen, the last alert organ of the mind terrified of decline. She would test her pomanders herself, ordering new mixtures when one faded. She could not trust her reflection, but she could trust her scent. In the metaphysics of her age, to be fragrant was to be blessed. To smell sweet in death was proof of sanctity. Saints' corpses, it was said, exhaled perfume as their souls ascended. Perhaps in her own way Elizabeth sought that miracle early, a body purified by roses, a death hidden beneath myrrh and ambergris. It was the ultimate illusion to conquer death not by avoiding decay but by disguising it. To those who knelt before her the Queen smelled like heaven. They could not know that beneath the cloud of sweetness her skin cracked, her heart raced, and her blood carried the scent of metal. The Virgin Queen had become the perfumed prisoner of her own myth, a woman who ruled through fragrance while quietly suffocating within it. In the next part we will see what happened when even the perfume could not conceal the truth, when her hair, once fiery and proud, began to fall away, and the crown of red turned to ash beneath the weight of time and poison. Of all the symbols that defined Elizabeth's power, none was more sacred than her hair. That cascade of fiery red, part Tudor inheritance, part myth, was the living flame of her identity. It burned in every portrait, caught the light in every courtly mask. To her people it was more than beauty, it was sovereignty itself. The lion's mane, her poets called it, the crown that needs no jewels, but even flames die. By her 50s the embers had begun to dim. The poisons that preserved her face, lid mercury vinegar, seeped inward, attacking the scalp. Strands came away on the comb. Her ladies brushing her hair each morning learned to hide their grief behind ritual. They gathered what fell, tied it discreetly in silk pouches, and burned it before anyone could see. A monarch's weakness was never to be left lying on the floor. The process of concealing her loss became an unspoken liturgy. What remained of her natural hair was stiffened with sugar water and egg whites arranged into fragile curls that glistened under candlelight but crumbled to dust at a touch. Over this fragile nest, her women fitted wigs of flame-red silk and horsehair, some said dyed with Venetian pigment, others with powdered saffron mixed with wine. The result was dazzling, but it was artifice through and through. Each wig was a construction, an edifice of illusion. It required hours to assemble the curls, combed the hairline, dusted with powder to blur the seam between real and false. Beneath the finished sculpture her scalp burned and bled. The attendants worked in near silence, afraid that any sign of pity might break the spell. When they were done, she would touch the wig lightly, testing its weight, and murmur her approval in the tone of a queen inspecting armour before battle. Hair had always been her weapon. In youth she had used it to charm and command the crown of virgin fire that dazzled diplomats, the beacon that made her seem touched by divinity. But now in age, the same weapon became her disguise. The fiery colour that once symbolised vitality was a memory she could no longer summon without deception. In that sense the wigs were more than vanity. They were theology. Tudor England saw hair as a moral text. Loose hair meant youth, passion, danger. Bound hair signified chastity and control. Elizabeth had always blurred these codes, wearing her tresses unbound in portraits to evoke innocence, yet covered with pearls and crowns to proclaim authority. Now in her decline, the wigs allowed her to continue that manipulation. Every curl, every shimmer of false flame was propaganda. The Virgin Queen could not go grey. She could not appear mortal. The irony was cruel. Each time the wig was placed upon her head, she was forced to confront the truth it concealed. Beneath the gold filigree, she was bald in patches, her scalp raw with sores from decades of cosmetics and sickness. When the attendants cleaned her wigs, they found traces of dried blood at the seams. They said nothing. Theirs was the work of tending a saint's relic, not beautifying a woman, but maintaining a miracle. One observer, writing years later, recalled that Her Majesty's hair was a thing of awe, not because it was fair, but because it was eternal. Eternal he meant in the way statues are eternal, unmoving, untouchable, deaf to the flesh beneath. The court adapted as it always did. Painters continued to show her with that same radiant crown, the same red flame gleaming like sunrise. No one depicted the veiled woman beneath the weight of silk and perfume, her head aching from the strain. The artists obeyed the unspoken rule: the Queen is what England needs her, to be not what she is. Sometimes late at night, when the attendants had withdrawn, she would remove the wig herself, a rare gesture of honesty. Her hair, sparse and grey, clung to her scalp in thin threads. She would run her fingers through it slowly, as if touching the last remnants of her youth. There were nights, they said, when she wept without sound, not for vanity, but for memory. To lose her hair was to lose her flame, and with it the illusion of permanence. Yet she endured as she always had through the choreography of denial. Each morning she rose aloud the attendants to rebuild her image, and emerged once more before her court radiant immortal crowned in borrowed fire. It was an act of defiance that bordered on holiness, for in that age a woman's power was always borrowed from lineage, from marriage, from God. Elizabeth borrowed hers from myth and refused to give it back. Even baldness could not humble her. She simply created a new form of majesty, the majesty of concealment. But in those private hours between dusk and ceremony, when the perfume faded and the candles burned low, the mask slipped. Then she was no longer Gloriana the Sun Queen, but a frail woman surrounded by relics of herself, wigs drying on stands, brushes sticky with sugar water, the air thick with the smell of vinegar and roses. The silence of those rooms must have been unbearable. The attendants waited outside, listening for the sound of the bell that summoned them back, the signal that the transformation was complete, that their queen had rebuilt herself again from the fragments of mortality. In that silence, the flame of England flickered. In the next part, we will enter even deeper into the private horror beyond wigs and powder, into the failing flesh itself. For as the queen's outer splendour grew heavier, her body beneath was collapsing, consumed by the poisons that once preserved her, and the stench of that decay could no longer be hidden by perfume alone. There are moments when history forgets to look away. For all her splendour and ceremony, Elizabeth Tudor lived her final years in quiet agony, an agony her subjects would never see because it hid beneath the silks, pearls and embroidered armour that defined her reign. The face of England, radiant in portraiture and legend, was attached to a body that had become a battlefield. Beneath the layers of brocade and lace, the queen's flesh was failing. Modern historians and physicians examining records of her health and the known effects of the cosmetics she used suggest a grim reality. Elizabeth's skin was raw, ulcerated and infected. Lead poisoning from Venetian ceruse does not merely mar the face, it compromises the immune system, causes neuropathy and interferes with the body's ability to heal. Mercury absorbed from her vermilion rouge inflames the nerves and attacks the kidneys. Combined, they create a slow-motion collapse, tremors, fatigue, chronic pain, and most devastatingly, the breakdown of tissue itself. By the 1590s, the courtiers closest to her would have noticed the signs, though none dared to speak of them. Her once erect posture had stooped. Her movements grew stiff, cautious, as if each step cost her something. The heavy gowns she wore, magnificent creations of velvet, satin, and metal thread embroidery, hid a body mottled with sores and lesions, skin irritated from constant friction against unwashed fabrics. Under the tight corsets, under the linen shifts changed daily, but never truly cleansing her flesh, chafed and festered. There are accounts discreet but haunting of attendants applying rose oil balms and vinegar compresses to her shoulders and arms. The queen could no longer bear the touch of soap or water. When a sore broke open, it was cleaned with wine and covered with silk patches before she was dressed again. And then came the paint, the familiar white mask brushed back over the wounds, sealing them from view, but not from pain. Modern dermatologists believe that prolonged exposure to ceruse would have caused contact dermatitis, inflamed weeping skin that cracked and peeled. Had the weight of metal-threaded gowns, the suffocating corsetry, and the absence of air or sunlight, and the result is easy to imagine a monarch trapped in her own body, her skin turning against her like a betrayed servant. Yet she did not yield. The court never saw her flinch. At banquets she sat among the gold and crystal, her smile fixed, her hands trembling only slightly as she raised her cup. Music played, courtiers laughed, the air shimmered with perfume and torchlight. But beneath the table her feet swelled painfully in their jewelled shoes. Beneath the lace collar her neck ached from tension, the muscles twitching from years of toxic strain. The white paint that made her look divine was cracking under the heat of the candles, the sweat beneath it stinging open wounds. Her ladies-in-waiting would sometimes find traces of blood on the inside of her bodices. They cleaned them silently, bleaching the stains with lemon and salt, saying nothing. Their duty was to maintain the illusion, to keep the queen immaculate, untouchable, eternal. To pity her was dangerous. To expose her suffering was unthinkable, and yet behind that cruelty lay a strange tenderness. The women who dressed her each morning saw what no one else did, the bruises at her shoulders, the red welts where jewellery had rubbed against irritated skin, the fatigue in her eyes. They were witnesses to a slow martyrdom performed not for faith but for image, a daily crucifixion by ceremony. Even her doctors were prisoners of her myth. The queen distrusted them deeply. She had outlived so many advisers, so many suitors, that she no longer believed medicine could improve upon will. "I will make myself well," she once told a physician, who begged her to rest, and for decades she had. She had survived smallpox, rebellion, assassination plots, and heartbreak. Why not this? But the body keeps its own counsel. By her 60s, she was plagued by insomnia and toothache, her gums receding, her joints swollen. The poisons in her bloodstream affected her balance. She stumbled more often. Her appetite waned. Some days she refused to eat, convinced that food might harbour death. Others she indulged in sweetmeats that only worsened her decay. Her attendants began to notice a peculiar pallor in her skin, not the whiteness of paint, but the greyish hue of exhaustion, as if even her blood had grown weary. And yet she never allowed herself to appear weak. The rituals of state continued, the royal audiences, the long hours of council, the masks, the progressions. She endured it all, because to withdraw would have meant admitting that Gloriana, the eternal queen, the body of England, was failing. The dichotomy was staggering. The same woman who dazzled her court in gowns stitched with pearls worth a city's ransom was underneath swathed in bandages and pain. The same hands that signed royal decrees were covered in gloves to hide trembling fingers. The same lips that proclaimed divine majesty were painted over the fevered twitch of decay. And through it all she maintained dignity. That is perhaps the most haunting truth of her final years, not the grotesque details of illness, but the sheer endurance of will. She kept the court believing. She made them see only what she wanted them to see, the embodiment of order, wisdom, and beauty, even as her body turned against her. At the great banquets of her later reign, as courtiers toasted her health, and poets recited verses to her eternal youth, the scent of roses filled the air. Beneath that sweetness, no one could smell the infection, the slow rot of the woman beneath the gown. The queen had become a living symbol, and symbols, unlike flesh, are not allowed to suffer. But she did, in silence, every day. In the next part, we will descend further into the palace itself, to the cesspits and hidden tunnels that mirrored her decay, and witness how the stench of empire's glory rose from beneath the very floorboards of power. Power, when you strip away its perfume, has an odour, and in Elizabeth's England that odour was unmistakable, a mixture of smoke, sweat, mildew, and human waste. The Tudor palaces were theatres of grandeur, but beneath their painted ceilings and golden tapestries ran a darker infrastructure, the pipes and pits of a medieval past. No matter how divine the monarch appeared in ceremony, her kingdom still stank like any other body. Whitehall, the beating heart of her court, was both palace and cesspit. The largest royal residence in Europe, it stretched across 23 acres and housed nearly 2,000 souls, courtiers, servants, musicians, cooks, laundresses, soldiers. Every one of them produced waste. And there were no drains, no running water, no plumbing worthy of the word. Chamber pots were emptied into courtyards' ditches or directly into the Thames. The Queen herself did not escape the practical indignities of her era. Her personal toilet was called a close stool, a padded wooden chair lined with velvet beneath which sat a ceramic bowl. When she finished, it was the job of a nobleman, the groom of the stool, to empty and clean it. To serve at that post was considered an honour. In the strange logic of monarchy, the one who dealt with the Queen's waste held unparalleled access to her privacy, her trust, her body, rank and rot intertwined. Below stairs, the filth was staggering. Beneath Whitehall and Hampton Court, great cesspits collected the runoff from hundreds of chamber pots. When they filled, as they often did, teams of gong farmers were summoned to clean them. These men, their faces covered in linen soaked with vinegar, descended into the pits at night, shoveling waste into buckets. They worked by candlelight, knee-deep in human refuse, paid well but despised, forbidden to appear near others by day, because of the stench that clung to them. Their labour was the unseen engine of monarchy. Without them, the royal apartments would have become uninhabitable within weeks, but their existence was rarely acknowledged. They were ghosts of the underworld, keeping the surface glittering by carrying its corruption away in the dark. Visitors from abroad noticed what courtiers pretended not to smell. The Venetian ambassador Giovanni Michiel wrote that the air of London was thick with smoke and filth, and Queen's palaces, though noble, give forth an odour of men. Another traveller, a German physician named Paul Hentzner, was struck by the sweet herbs strewn on floors to disguise the ill savour that ariseth from beneath. Even the walls recorded the truth. Rushes and straw laid on the floors were rarely changed. Scraps of food, hair, vomit, and insects collected within them. Under the sweetness of lavender and rosemary lay the rot of daily life. The perfumed corridors where courtiers recited poetry were at the core compost heaps. Yet above this decay, the theatre of purity continued. When Elizabeth entered the great hall for banquets, the crowd erupted in awe. The scent of incense filled the air. Candles gleamed on silver and gold. Musicians played as servants carried roasted swans, gilded pies and sugared fruits. But beneath the flagstones, only a few feet below the dancers' feet, the cesspits waited vast, silent breathing chambers of waste. Every banquet, every masque, every triumphal feast was staged above a foundation of filth. It was an almost perfect metaphor for her reign magnificence built on denial. The Empire. Elizabeth set in motion the ships sent to plunder the colonies conceived in ambition began in this same paradox. The myth of civilization rising from rot, the illusion that glory can stand without consequence, that waste disappears once it is hidden well enough. The palaces of power, then and now, have always depended on the invisible labour of those condemned to clean up after it. The Queen herself understood the smell's power, even if she could not eliminate it. Her progressions, the grand royal tours across the countryside, were as much about escape as display. Each time the air of one palace grew unbearable, she would relocate her entire household, hundreds of courtiers' wagons and guards. Whitehall to Richmond, Richmond to Greenwich to Windsor. The cycle never stopped. The move was called a progress, but it was also a flight, a desperate attempt to outrun the odour of her own magnificence. When she arrived in a new palace, the gardens were scented with rosewater, the rushes freshly laid, the chambers fumigated with herbs. For a few weeks the illusion of cleanliness returned. Then the cycle of accumulation began again, waste rising like the tide beneath the gilded floor. The contradiction was cosmic. The ruler who embodied divine order lived surrounded by the chaos of human necessity. The Virgin Queen. The symbol of purity presided over one of the filthiest courts in Europe. And yet somehow that contradiction sustained her. It was as if she drew strength from her own defiance of nature, from the very act of appearing immaculate while the world beneath her decomposed. Modern historians have found in her palaces the same lesson they find in empires, that rot is not failure but foundation. The grandeur of Whitehall, like the grandeur of empire itself, depended on what it refused to see. Beneath every tapestry and throne was the same truth waste hidden and unacknowledged, keeping the illusion alive. When the Queen of England walked through her perfumed corridors, she must have known. The smell of roses could only disguise, never erase. Every sweetness has its pit, every empire its cesspool. The scent of glory is always mixed with decay. And in the end, that was the scent of Elizabeth's crown, not perfume, not incense, but the faint, enduring odour of what power leaves behind. In the next part, we will descend further still into the world of the groom of the stool, the man whose duty was to serve the Queen in her most private moments, and whose strange intimacy reveals how even waste in the Tudor world was a currency of power. Every monarchy needs its angels, but it also needs its shadows. And in the palaces of Tudor England, no one lived more fully in that shadow than the groom of the stool, the man whose duty was to serve the Queen in her most private unspoken moments. His title sounds crude to modern ears, yet in the 16th century it carried reverence. The groom of the stool was no mere servant. He was the guardian of the royal body, a body that symbolized the state sanctified by divine right, yet subject to all the ordinary needs of flesh. His task was to manage those needs with silence, precision, and grace. He alone attended to the Queen's close stool, the padded velvet chair concealing a ceramic chamber pot beneath. He prepared it, maintained its cleanliness, and stood nearby ready to offer cloths or wash water when called. But the significance of his role reached far beyond hygiene. To handle the monarch's waste was to handle her mortality, and to prove oneself unafraid of it. It required an intimacy deeper than touch and understanding of vulnerability. The groom saw what no minister or courtier could see, the sovereign stripped of regalia, stripped of pretense, human at last. And in that paradox lay his power. The grooms were always noblemen, chosen not for civility but for trust. Their proximity gave them influence beyond measure. They overheard private words, devoured sealed letters, managed the privy purse, and often became political advisers. In a court obsessed with access, no door was more valuable than the one leading to the Queen's chamber. To serve at her stool was to live in the delicate space between reverence and contamination. The groom was both indispensable and tainted. His hands touched what others pretended did not exist, the bodily evidence that their semi-divine ruler was in the end human. Courtiers bowed to him in daylight, but whispered behind fans at night, half in awe, half in disgust. Elizabeth understood the symbolism of his role perfectly. She had inherited the office from her father's court, where Henry VIII's grooms were among the most powerful men in England. She appointed her own carefully men of impeccable loyalty, often long-serving attendants from her youth. To them she showed a guarded affection. They were witnesses to her privacy, custodians of her dignity. Imagine the quiet routine, the soft knock on the privy chamber door, the murmur of permission, the rustle of linen. The groom enters bowing low, carrying fresh cloths and rose-scented water. The queen, veiled or partially hidden by a screen, gives no acknowledgement beyond a nod. The act is performed in silence, the same silence that governs prayer. When finished, the groom seals away the waste and retreats without turning his back, a ritual as codified as Mass. It was a grotesque choreography of hierarchy and grace. In that stillness, the contradictions of monarchy were condensed into a single gesture: sacred flesh and human need, distance and dependence, dignity and degradation. The groom's duty was to erase what should never exist, to carry away proof that the Virgin Queen's body functioned like any other. Historians have long noted the strange dignity of the post. The groom of the stool received high wages, fine lodgings, and near limitless access to the royal ear. In council meetings, when others debated policy, the groom could lean forward with quiet authority and say, "Her Majesty prefers otherwise," and none would dare question him. His intimacy made him untouchable. But it also marked him. In a world where smell defined morality, he was permanently close to impurity. Even bathed in rose water and wrapped in silk gloves, he carried the symbolic odour of what he touched. He lived at the crossroads of sanctity and shame, a reminder that power's most exalted throne still rested upon a hidden stool. There is something profoundly human in that image, the queen of an empire dependent on a single loyal man to manage the evidence of her existence. It collapses the distance between ruler and ruled heaven and earth. No ceremony, no jewel, no hymn could erase that daily truth. And perhaps that is why Elizabeth guarded the office so fiercely. It reminded her privately, painfully, that divinity must always be maintained by hands willing to do the unholy. The groom was her confessor without words, her silent keeper of decay. In hymn class and servitude reversed their logic. To be close to power was to risk contamination. To cleanse the sovereign was to absorb a little of her corruption. But for a Tudor courtier there was no higher honour than that. Every age has its grooms of the stool, those who manage the hidden machinery of greatness while pretending it does not smell. They exist still, though their titles have changed. Aides, advisors, fixers, handlers. They preserve the illusion that power is pure, when in truth it has always been serviced in secret by hands that dare not flinch. In the next part, we will see how this same paradox expands beyond the chamber, how the entire royal court, moving from palace to palace, became a vast choreography of denial, a nomadic theatre, fleeing from its own stench and mortality in pursuit of the illusion of divine order. Elizabeth's England did not sit still, neither did its queen. For all her titles and divine authority, the Virgin Queen lived like a fugitive, not from enemies or assassins, but from smell sickness and time itself. Her palaces, grand as they appeared, were prisons of rot. No amount of perfume or pomp could disguise the creeping odours of waste, mildew and decay that seeped through the stones. And so the court moved endlessly, ceremoniously, in what one historian has called the ritual of flight. Every year, Elizabeth's household packed itself into motion. Hundreds of courtiers, guards, cooks, seamstresses, and scribes, nearly 1,000 souls in all, formed a moving city that rolled across southern England like a royal tide. Whitehall, Richmond, Greenwich, Hampton Court, Windsor. The cycle repeated in glittering monotony. The official reason was progress, a display of majesty among her people. The unofficial truth was starker. Each palace had to be abandoned, periodically left to air out, while its cesspits were emptied and its rushes replaced. When the stench became unbearable, the Queen simply moved the throne elsewhere. Her mobility became her hygiene. The logistics were staggering. Every relocation took weeks of preparation. Servants dismantled her bedchamber tapestries, silver mirrors, wardrobes of gowns, and loaded them onto carts. The royal plate was wrapped in straw and guarded like treasure. The horses were shod anew, the road surveyed, the weather watched. Even the Queen's close stool travelled with her, carried in its own carriage by attendants sworn to silence. Behind the royal procession trailed a second less visible army, the cleaners, carpenters, cooks and laundresses who restored the palace she had just vacated. They scoured walls, aired out rooms, dug fresh ditches for waste. It was a never-ending loop of cleansing and contamination, an empire of motion built to outrun its own corruption. To the common folk who lined the roads, the spectacle was breathtaking. Trumpets sounded. The royal banners unfurled. The sun glinted on armour and silk as Elizabeth passed her carriage, draped in gold cloth, her face a calm mask of purity. They cheered as if they were witnessing the divine, and in a way they were. For her movement through the land was no mere travel. It was pilgrimage and performance combined. Each stop reaffirmed her vitality. Each departure erased the traces of decay left behind. The court followed like pilgrims in her wake. They lived out of trunks and wagons, chasing the scent of royal favour from one palace to the next. Poets wrote sonnets on horseback. Secretaries drafted state papers by candlelight in draughty inns. The air was filled with a strange mixture of reverence and fatigue incense, and sweat parchment and mud. Within this grand mobility lay a kind of denial elevated to art. By never remaining in one place long enough for decay to settle, Elizabeth could pretend that she too remained untouched by time. Movement became her method of reinvention. Each new palace offered her a new beginning, new rushes underfoot, new perfume in the air, new courtiers to impress. The endless travel blurred the distinction between preservation and escape. To her subjects, the Queen's progression symbolized vitality, the monarch bringing light wherever she went. But to those inside her orbit, they were exhaustion disguised as ceremony. The cost was immense, hundreds of wagons groaning under the weight of furniture and clothing, oxen collapsing in the mud, servants sleeping in barns or under carts. Yet no one complained aloud. They knew the deeper logic the court moved, not because it must, but because the Queen could not bear stillness. Stillness smelled of rot, of mirrors of death, and so England learned to breathe with her. The kingdom's rhythms followed her movements like a heartbeat, expansion and contraction, arrival and departure. As she aged, those circuits became tighter, slower, almost ritualistic, circling the same safe palaces near London, as though the world had narrowed to a perfumed maze she no longer dared to leave. When plague came, as it did again and again, the ritual turned desperate. The approach of disease was announced by the tolling of bells and the closing of city gates. At the first sign, the royal convoy fled into the countryside. Courtiers stuffed their gloves with spices and vinegar-soaked rags, believing the odours would ward off contagion. Behind them, London emptied its streets, echoing with the rattle of death carts. The Queen would retreat to Windsor or Richmond, ringed by guards, insisting on fresh herbs in every corridor and fires burning, day and night, to purify the air. She feared no army as much as she feared a fever. And perhaps in that constant motion there was a metaphor she understood better than any philosopher. To rule was to run from stench, from aging, from memory, from the truth of one's own body. Power could not be stationary. It had to shimmer like perfume in air impossible to pin down. Each journey was a shedding of the old skin, a renewal of the illusion. The courtiers joked that Her Majesty was the swiftest traveller in Christendom. But beneath the humour lay reverence and pity. They saw what the people could not, a woman waging a lifelong campaign against decay, using motion as her weapon. Each palace she left behind bore the ghost of her presence, the lingering scent of roses, the faint imprint of a mask that had smiled for too long. When she entered a new residence, the first thing she did was throw open the windows. She stood there breathing deeply, as if inhaling proof that she had outrun whatever haunted her. For a moment perhaps she believed it, but no one outruns the air forever. In the next part we will see how this pursuit of purity, this endless movement away from filth and mortality, evolved into a mythology, how sermons and pageants turned her physical decay into divine endurance, and how England learned to worship the illusion that its queen could never die. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, the woman who could no longer bear mirrors had become one. Her body, frail and failing, was reflected endlessly in the nation's imagination, polished, perfected, and exalted, until even her decay gleamed with sanctity. What had begun as artifice became theology. It is one of the great paradoxes of her age, that the more her flesh betrayed her, the more her image was sanctified. Painters, poets, and preachers conspired consciously or not to transform human deterioration into divine mystery. The Queen's weakness became the kingdom's strength, her aging a kind of miracle. Sermons proclaimed that God himself had preserved her, that her long life was proof of divine favour. When she appeared in public trembling and thin, her frailty was interpreted as holiness, a saintly body sustained by will alone. The people who saw her did not see sickness, they saw endurance. "Our sun, though low, still shineth," one preacher declared in 1601, likening her to a celestial body refusing to sit. Court pageants echoed the theme. Elizabeth carried on a litter draped in gold, was greeted by allegories, time kneeling before her, death retreating, the Virgin of Light conquering darkness. The language of empire blurred into liturgy. Her wrinkles became the sacred furrows of wisdom, her faltering steps the pilgrimage of virtue. in poetry that she was no longer woman, but phoenix, ever dying, ever reborn. The irony was cruel. The very thing she sought to hide, her odour, her sores, her trembling hands, became the source of her mystique. When she appeared pale and near collapse during her final years, her courtiers whispered not of poison or pain, but of transfiguration. To them she was beyond flesh, an anointed vessel slowly ascending. Her suffering purified her image. Her rot smelled of roses. This was not delusion alone. It was propaganda of genius, the triumph of image over evidence. England needed her to be timeless. After decades of war, reform and upheaval, the Queen's endurance had become the nation's reassurance. To admit her mortality was to admit that the order she embodied might vanish with her. So the myth evolved Elizabeth as divine intermediary, half human, half symbol. A virgin, unspoiled, a goddess of chastity, whose body could not decay because it was no longer entirely of this world. The Church reinforced it. In official homilies, bishops compared her to biblical heroines, to Deborah Esther, the Virgin Mary women who ruled through virtue rather than bloodline. She has wrote one court preacher, the mirror of incorruption, the earthly sign of eternal providence. The metaphor was deliberate mirror, not body. The reflection mattered more than the flesh. Meanwhile, the reality behind those mirrors worsened. Her attendants continued to dress the sores on her arms and shoulders to mask her trembling with stiff collars and heavy sleeves. The paint on her face thickened until it cracked under candlelight. Her wig grew heavier, the false curls piled high to distract from the thinning beneath. Those closest to her could see the dissonance, a living saint on the throne yet bleeding beneath the brocade. They sustained the illusion because it sustained them. To question the myth was to question the crown. Painters who glimpsed her unpainted face were forbidden to record it. Only the approved iconography could circulate Elizabeth standing over maps of the world, her feet on continents, her gaze fixed toward eternity. The portraits from her final years, the rainbow, the Ditchley, the Armada, show her face smooth as porcelain, ageless, unbroken. They are not depictions, they are prayers. Even the smells of her court, the overwhelming rosewater, the burning herbs, became liturgical. The palace itself was a cathedral of denial, its air thick with incense to hide the scent of mortality. Her courtiers believed, or pretended to believe, that she carried not the odour of sickness but of sanctity. To serve her was to breathe the perfume of divinity. And perhaps in a sense it was true. For what is sainthood if not the transformation of suffering into symbol? What is empire if not a cathedral built on denial? Elizabeth turned her bodily decay into national faith. Her endurance, the refusal to die, to reveal weakness, to surrender the illusion, became England's proof that it too could transcend the mortal chaos of history. But illusions are most powerful at the edge of collapse. In her final months, the myth of divine purity was both triumph and tragedy. The Queen no longer slept. She sat in darkness, refusing food, refusing the doctors who begged to ease her pain. To her court, this became further proof of sanctity, the Queen fasting like a saint keeping vigil with her God. Yet it was not holiness that kept her awake. It was fear that sleep meant surrender, fear that the next dawn would arrive without her. When she finally lay dying at Richmond Palace in March 1603, the mask was still intact. Those present said her face appeared serene, her body uncorrupted. She was dressed in white, a final act of theatre purity to the last breath. As her pulse slowed, someone whispered the old litany, "The Queen is immortal." And in a way she was. The myth had succeeded. By the time her heart stopped, Elizabeth Tudor had long ceased to exist. What remained was Gloriana, a sanctified fiction powerful enough to outlive its author. History too has preserved the perfume while forgetting the stench. In the next part, we will turn to that afterlife, to what her death revealed to the relics she left behind, and to the question that haunted those who survived her when the mask at last was lowered. What, if anything, remained of the woman underneath, the Queen who had once embodied eternity, now measured time by her heartbeat? By the winter of 1602, Elizabeth Tudor Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the Sun of England, had become a flickering candle in her own night. The mask that had protected her for decades was still in place, but behind it the body of England's monarch was giving way. Sleep abandoned her. Each night she paced the cold floors of Richmond Palace, her steps echoing down corridors hung with fading tapestries. She refused her bed. To lie down, she told her ladies, was to invite death. For weeks she remained upright, standing, sitting, dozing in a high-backed chair, her frail form wrapped in shawls, her eyes hollow and unblinking. She would not suffer the curtains to be drawn, one attendant wrote. She feared darkness as though it were a grave. The courtiers tiptoed through her chambers whispering prayers. The great queen who had once commanded empires now sat surrounded by silence and shadows. Her mind wandered between lucidity and reverie, murmuring half-remembered Latin psalms and the names of her dead. Leicester, Essex, Walsingham, her mother. The ghosts of her life gathered invisibly around her as if waiting their turn to be acknowledged. Her body, once an emblem of divine endurance, now betrayed every secret it had hidden. The trembling worsened, her joints swelled, her gums bled. The makeup could no longer disguise the grey pallor beneath. She could barely eat, the pain in her mouth too sharp, the sickness too constant. Her attendants dabbed her lips with rosewater, brushed her hair, what little remained, and tried to coax her into rest. She refused. The word, Mastroianni told them, is not to be used to princes. She was still performing even then, especially then, but the performance had turned into a kind of exile. Outside her walls the kingdom waited in uneasy quiet. The courtiers who had worshipped her youth now circled her deathbed, like anxious planets waiting for their sun to go dark. England's future hung on every breath she took. The Virgin Queen had no heir. No child would inherit her crown. Her death would not only end a life, it would end an era, the Tudor century itself. The aging of her body was the aging of her nation. The radiant empire of the 1580s, the age of Shakespeare, Raleigh, Drake, had begun to fade. The gold of discovery had tarnished into debt. The Armada victory had become a memory. The same exhaustion that overtook the Queen ran through her realm hunger, after failed harvests, plague in the cities and unease in the soul of England. As her body cracked, so did the illusion of invincibility she had spent her life maintaining. There is something almost cosmic in how she faced it. Elizabeth had always ruled through symbol, her body as England's body, her chastity as its virtue, her face as its sun. Now that symbol was failing, and the court did not know how to separate the woman from the myth. To see her weak was to glimpse mortality in the mirror of the realm. In February 1603 she fell into long silences. When asked if she would name a successor, she would only whisper, "I will have no rascal succeed me." But time had stopped obeying her. Her speech became slow and uncertain. Her mind drifted into visions. Some nights she stared for hours at the wall, eyes fixed on nothing, as if watching the ghosts of her own reign. The accounts of her final weeks are tinged with reverence and horror. Sir Robert Carey, who was present, wrote that she sat like a statue, motionless and speechless, her finger ever upon her lip. Others described her standing by the window for entire days, staring into the cold grey river, unwilling to turn away. She would not let anyone move her to bed until exhaustion overcame her strength. When at last she consented, she lay down on a heap of cushions spread upon the floor, not a bed, but something less permanent, less confining. It was as though she could accept dying only if she could pretend she was still upright. Her ladies wept silently as they watched her breathe shallow and irregular. The perfumes that once surrounded her, roses, amber civet, had faded. The chamber smelled of wax-cold air and sickness. In the stillness she murmured a few last words. All my possessions for one moment of time, whether she truly said them or whether they were invented by posterity hardly matters. They captured the truth of her reign, the woman who mastered time, finally bargaining with it. On the night of March 23rd, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor died. She had reigned 44 years, survived 20 assassination plots, and transformed her body into a nation's myth. Yet death arrived not as an executioner, but as an unmasker, soft, absolute, indifferent to perfume or paint. When her attendants entered at dawn, they found her still dressed in white, her face serene, her hands folded. The body that had terrified men and inspired poets was now a husk. The performance ended. They said her skin looked translucent, almost luminous, as though the poison that had once corroded her had now made her angelic. The illusion had cracked, but even in breaking it shimmered. Outside, the bells of London tolled. The Virgin Queen was gone, and with her, the age that bore her name. The courtiers bowed as protocol required, but many wept, not only for the monarch who had ruled them, but for themselves, for the loss of the illusion that England could remain forever golden, forever young, forever untouched by decay. Her death was not the fall of an empire, but its awakening. The mask that had hidden the truth for half a century finally shattered, revealing not corruption or glory, but something simpler, more human. A woman who had fought to hold the light as long as she could. In the next and final part, we will step back from the chamber of death and trace what followed, the relics, the memory, the transformation of the Queen, From mortal woman to eternal legend, and the uneasy lesson she left to history, that every crown, no matter how radiant, is built on the fragile body beneath. When they lifted the mask from Elizabeth's face, the body beneath was mortal pale, spent, unguarded. But the world refused to see it that way. The Queen who had died at Richmond was swiftly embalmed in story. Within weeks, the painters and preachers were at work again, coating her memory in the same white veneer she had worn in life. The flesh perished, the image endured. Her funeral in April 1603 was a final act of theatre. The coffin draped in cloth of gold was borne through London on a black-draped chariot drawn by horses caparisoned in velvet. On top lay her effigy, lifelike and smiling, dressed in a white gown, a sceptre in one hand and an orb in the other. It was the last portrait wax where there had been flesh serenity, where there had been fear. As the crowds watched her pass, many swore she looked as if she slept. Perhaps they meant it kindly. Perhaps it was relief. The Virgin Queen at last would not wake. But death for Elizabeth was not an end. It was a beginning the moment her story escaped her control and entered the hands of those who needed her more as symbol than woman. For centuries after, England reshaped her to match its needs. The Stuarts turned her into a memory of lost glory. The Victorians sanctified her as the mother of empire, pure, chaste, unyielding, the moral ancestor of their own imperial ideal. 19th century biographers polished her until she gleamed again, erasing the human contradictions that had once defined her. They preferred her powdered, not bleeding, commanding, not trembling. But modern historians, armed with science and suspicion, have peeled layers back. They have looked beneath the paint literally. Infrared imaging of her portraits reveals how artists reworked her features, smoothing lines, whitening skin, enlarging eyes, removing signs of age. The real Elizabeth hides beneath each layer, like a palimpsest, the living face overwritten by perfection. The scholars who examine her life today no longer seek divinity but diagnosis. They read her symptoms, the tremors, the mood swings, the insomnia as evidence of lead and mercury poisoning, malnutrition, perhaps depression. In their hands, the Queen becomes a patient, her court a laboratory of pathology. The Virgin Queen, once symbol of eternal order, becomes the first casualty of her own propaganda. And yet even in this revision, something resists exposure. The myth still gleams. Every century finds a new light to cast on her, martyr of beauty, victim of patriarchy, genius of performance, architect of nationhood. Her story endures precisely because it can never be finally revealed. The more we strip away, the more remains. Walk through the National Portrait Gallery in London, and you'll see it, the strange calm in her painted eyes, the illusion holding even now. Beneath the cracked varnish and faded pigments, she still radiates the light that once blinded her court. The viewer leans in, searching for the woman behind the mask, and finds only reflection, the gaze of an age still enthralled by its own illusion of control, its own longing to be untouchable. What remains under the paint is not simply a queen, but a question what happens when image outlives truth. Elizabeth's legacy is both triumph and warning. She mastered the art of appearing eternal, and in doing so forfeited the right to be seen as human. Her courage and cruelty, her loneliness and brilliance all dissolve into the alabaster mask she left behind. The portraits endure not because they are faithful, but because they are necessary mirrors for every generation's idea of power. We look at her now and see our own contradictions staring back: ambition and fragility, illusion and decay, the desperate wish to make time yield. History has preserved her as purity incarnate. But beneath every layer of white lies the same truth she once tried to conceal, that power, like paint cracks. That beauty built on denial must eventually flake away, that even the greatest myths begin and end in flesh. And perhaps that is her final gift, the understanding that the mask and the woman were never enemies. They were one. She taught her kingdom, and all who came after that, the body politic is always painted, always perfumed, always rotting underneath, and that we go on loving it precisely because it will not last. In the next and final part, we will return to where this journey began. The quiet question behind all spectacle: what can her story teach us about ourselves, about the masks we wear, and the fragile dignity of being seen at last without them? Lessons from a powdered throne. What Elizabeth I still teaches us about ourselves. History remembers Queen Elizabeth I as one of the most formidable rulers to ever sit upon a throne. She defied empires, reshaped faith, and ushered England into an age of art and exploration. Yet behind the portraits and triumphs was another story, one written in leaden mercury and sleepless nights and trembling hands. It is a story not of conquest but of illusion. Elizabeth's greatest masterpiece was not empire but image. She built a nation around the belief that she was eternal, untouched by decay, unshaken by fear, immune to time itself. Her painted face became a national emblem, her endurance a kind of religion. Even as her body crumbled beneath the poison of her own cosmetics, she refused to let the mask slip. To rule, she believed, was to be seen, and to be seen one had to control the seeing. There is a strange familiarity to that belief. Centuries have passed, but we have not abandoned the powdered throne. We too build our crowns from illusion, only now the mirror is digital, the court global. We filter, we curate, we polish our reflections until they shine. We measure our worth by how well we perform composure, how convincingly we conceal fatigue, grief, or imperfection. Like Elizabeth, we learn to fear stillness. We confuse image for identity, attention for love, endurance for strength. But the truth that destroyed her is the same truth that still saves us. Every mask cracks eventually, and when it does, the person beneath must be ready to face the world without it. Elizabeth's story is not a warning against beauty or ambition, it is a meditation on balance. Her genius lay in understanding that appearances hold power, but her tragedy was believing they could replace reality. The longer she sustained the illusion of divine purity, the more it consumed her, until even her restlessness became ritual, her silence a form of denial. In our own time, the lesson is gentler but no less urgent. The pressure to appear perfect to lead to inspire to succeed, without faltering, still whispers in our ears. Yet the courage that endures is not the courage of the painted face, it is the courage of honesty, to admit exhaustion, to let the world see the tremor in your hand and still call it grace. Elizabeth's reign ended with quiet dignity. Her legend, however, endures because it speaks to something universal, the human desire to be both loved and invulnerable. But perhaps her greatest legacy is the understanding that power without self-compassion corrodes from within. We are all in some way seated on the powdered thrones, curating lives for others to admire, polishing masks to hide the fragile truth beneath. But the beauty of history lies in its second chances. Where Elizabeth's world demanded perfection, ours can choose authenticity. Her story asks us across 4 centuries a single question worth carrying into our own mirrors. When the paint finally fades, what remains of you that is real? Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.